Okay, so in today's video, we're going to be discussing bivariate correlations. So in other words, association claims. Not exactly association claims, but almost exactly the same thing. An association claim is the claim you make based on a bivariate correlation. That's pretty much what it is, right? So when we're discussing bivariate correlations, it simply means correlations between two variables. So keep that in mind. You're not claiming that one is causing the other, right? So keep that in mind. We're not claiming that. But we are claiming that there's an association. It seems like as one goes up, the other goes up, a positive association, or a negative association, which I like to call an inverse association. As one goes up, the other goes down. Either is an association, right? There seems to be some reaction from both variables to each other. Now, I almost said when one changes, the other changes. That's more causal. They do change together, but we don't know which one's leading to the changes in the other one, right? That would be a causal claim. If I said more exercise leads to weight loss, I'm making a causal claim. If I say it seems like when I'm stressed, I gain more weight, that's an association claim. And it seems like, it looks like versus leads to, causes, right? So we're going to be focusing on bivariate correlations. Let's go on to the next slide, and just to give you an example and a breakdown based on how your book describes it. So first of all, you need two variables. You cannot have a bivariate correlation without two variables. It's in the name. Bi meaning two, variate is another word for variable, factor. So you have an association between two variables. You have a relationship between the two variables, right? You have a correlation. And keeping that last point on the left in mind, we don't know which one causes which. We're not claiming causation. In this example I have here with the arrows, the top one, so look at the top arrow, the green arrow, cell phone use, and the red arrow, GPA. As cell phone use goes up, GPA goes down. That's a negative correlation. That's still a correlation. That's still a bivariate correlation. And below that, you have cell phone use. As cell phone use goes up, anxiety goes up. Here I'm explaining another bivariate correlation, right? One's inverse, right? As one goes up, the other one goes down instead of them going up together. But that's still a bivariate correlation. So keep in mind, you can have both kinds of bivariate correlations. Now, just to give you an idea of what this might look like and what kind of data we're working with, here we have a table. And let me go over the columns. So the first column is participants. Here they call it person. You have person A through person ZZ, right? So you have many, many participants. And then you have their score on a well-being scale, right? And you have their score on how often they participate in deep talk, deep conversation. Not just, how's it going? Good. What'd you do at work today? Nothing. How'd work go? Okay. Right? Not that kind of conversation, but like, well, why are we here? If I'm going to go to school, what's my purpose in the world? And if we all are going to die at some point, what's the meaning of what we're doing right now? How can we make these moments meaningful? What's our relationship like? Do you think we've been drifting apart? That's kind of heavy, right? These are kind of heavy questions, but deep conversations, that's what you're getting into. So there's some claim being made here that there's an association, or in this case, a bivariate correlation between how well you're doing, your well-being, and how much of these deep conversations we engage in. If you look at the scores, you see that you have a different score per person, right? So this relationship might be different per person, but we care about the averages. We don't care about individuals. We care about, on average, what does it look like for all students or all adults. I'm not exactly sure what population Mel et al. Recruited, but that's something to keep in mind. That's something we would look into. But they did find a correlation, a bivariate correlation, with the more deep talk you're involved in, the higher the well-being score is. But because they can't claim causation, we don't know, is well-being causing more deep talk? Like, are people who are doing better, who are doing well, are they engaging in more deep talk? Or are people who engage in more deep talk, as a result, they're better because of that? We don't know what the direction is. And that's kind of one of the limitations of a bivariate correlation. We know there's a relationship, but we don't know which is causing which. Going back to the saying that I try to avoid because it's a cliche and you've heard it in every single class, but it's true. You can't claim causation. Well, let me say how you usually hear it. Correlation does not imply causation, right? You can't claim causation just by having a correlation. There's a relationship there. We're not denying that, but we don't know which is causing which. We have individuals in our studies that might have different relationships between well-being and deep talk, but we care on the averages. We don't care about what it is for you. Well, that sounds kind of mean, but we care about, on average, what it is for most people. On average, what is it for all adults, right? So keep that in mind. When we're dealing with statistics and bivariate correlations and even other types of statistics in psychology, they care about the average, not about the individual, because they want to generalize these findings to the population, right? Not just to you. Okay, that still sounds mean. But anyways, we're going to review describing bivariate correlations. So we're going to review that in this video. And we're going to review describing bivariate correlations between two quantitative variables and a quantitative variable and categorical. And we'll go over what a categorical variable is again in the next few slides. So main thing about a bivariate correlation between two quantitative variables is that we're dealing with things we can count. So most of the times we're dealing with things that you can count from 0 to 100 or more, right? Maybe to infinity. How many people visited the store? Or it might not have a real zero, and it might be IQ and how that's correlated with study time or even income, right? So these are all quantitative variables. So here's an example of a quantitative bivariate correlation, or a bivariate correlation with two quantitative variables. Let's take a look at the table. So on the table, you see that we have some guidelines for evaluating the strength of a bivariate correlation, right? In this case, the quantitative variables are percentage of deep talk and the well-being scale. Okay, so let's say this was your score. You had an R coefficient of 0.28. So keep in mind that this R coefficient, or what I'm trying to think about what other terms you might have heard before. This correlational statistic tells you the strength, the strength of the relationship between those two quantitative variables, right? So keep that in mind. This statistic, the R coefficient, tells us the strength between deep talk and well-being. Now, to evaluate the strength, we have Cohen's guidelines. So here, actually, this is where you should look at the table, right? Now you know the R coefficient. Now you look at this table, and you have to decide, well, is it small, medium, or large effect size? Effect size is just another word for the strength of the relationship. So keep that in mind. If I'm asking you for the effect size, I'm asking you in a bivariate correlation, I'm asking you for the strength between the relationship between the two variables. How strongly are they correlated? In other words, right? So in that situation, you would look at Cohen's guidelines and use these guidelines to decide, right? So you can see that up to 0.10 or negative 10, right? From 0 to 0.10 or 0.1 and negative 0.1, it's a weak correlation. And negative counts as well because we can have a negative correlation. That simply means you have an inverse relationship between the two variables. If you have between about 0.11 and 0.3 medium, and above that, above 0.3, it would be a strong relationship. Some of you might be thinking, well, that seems pretty low. Like, you mean I can have 0.5 and that's considered a strong relationship? In psychology, yes. Mostly because when we're dealing with humans, there's so many variables involved, right? Even if you have control over everything in the lab setting, there's so many things that can impact how people interact, so many variables impacting and influencing how people behave, that you can't completely isolate those variables you care about. Like you could in a microbiology lab, right? You could say, like in a microbiology lab, you can grow your participants, right? You could say, okay, I need to grow more of these cells. You can't do that for humans, not ethically, right? So because of that, these are our guidelines, right? Because you might be used to, 0.8 is a large correlation. Not in the social sciences. In the social sciences, we're using these guidelines. So know these for the exam, have them handy, right? So here's another relationship between two quantitative variables. We have multitasking ability on the y-axis. So on the left, on the bottom, you have how often people use multimedia. So in other words, how often you check your cell phone, right? How often do you multitask on your laptop? How many windows do you have open, right? So they actually found there's a negative correlation between how many things you're doing on your device, phone, laptop, computer, whatever, or tablet, and your actual ability to multitask, right? When they give you a task and they ask you to do two things or more at the same time. So you might think, oh, look at me, I'm so good. I can write this paper, I can watch a movie, I can send this email, I can chat with a friend, I can see the new PlayStation 5 reveal, and I'm still getting this essay done. No, you're not. You're getting it done at a much, much slower rate than you would if you just focus on that one thing. And actually, if you're doing that, the more engaged people reported being in this way of using the technology, right? Having multiple windows open, the worse they were at actually multitasking. So let me explain it based on this scatter plot. So first of all, what gives it away is that R coefficient. The R coefficient is telling me as one goes up, the other goes down. And actually, I should take some of that back because the way I was speaking about it made it sound causal, right? I said, the more you do this, the more this happens. Well, okay, I can't claim the direction, but there's definitely a relationship there. Maybe people who are not good at multitasking just have a bunch of windows open and tend to get distracted easily. That's actually what might be happening instead of the other direction happening. So you would look at that R coefficient and you know there's a negative relationship, meaning as one goes up, the other one goes down. But you can also look at the scatter plot. If you look at the scatter plot, it looks like it's going from the top left to the bottom right. And if you pick out dots and look at the actual values you have, you'll notice that people who are high on actual multitasking ability will be lower on frequency of media multitasking. So there's various ways you can do this. If you have the R coefficient, look at that. Is it positive or negative? If you have the scatter plot, look at overall the direction it looks like it's going. And then still looking at the scatter plot, you can pick a few dots. These dots represent participants. You could pick a few participants and see, well, people who scored higher on one variable, how are they scoring on the other variable? So, get some practice in with evaluating these kind of scatter plots and getting comfortable with interpreting them and interpreting these R coefficients. Then also, the last thing I forgot to mention, that last question, is this a medium, large, or weak effect size? So it's a negative 0.19. Based on that, what would you think? Now, I think this one's I'm going to probably give you values that are closer to these actual values rather than something in the middle, because 0.19 is right between small and medium. So on the exam, so I would say if you said medium or even small, it's in between, right, in terms of effect size. If I gave you something like this on the exam, I am going to give you this on the exam. I'm going to give you examples that are close to one or the other to make it clear which one it is. I'm not going to choose vague numbers, so keep that in mind. Okay, so now dealing with bivariate correlations with categorical variables. So let's go over this example. In this example, you're describing in these kind of bivariate correlations relationships with one quantitative variable and one categorical variable. Now, categorical variable, think of it as, well, it's hard not to describe it without saying categories. So think of it as different categories instead of a number value. So for example, gender would be a categorical variable. What is your gender? These are your options. What is your ethnicity? These are your options. Something like income could be quantitative if you have them list, from $0 to $200,000 a year. What's your income? That's quantitative. But you can make it categorical if you create categories instead. For example, what is your income? Low income, middle class, high income. Those are categories. So now that's a categorical variable. In this example, I have colors of cats. Get it? Categorical variable. This is where I pause in class for all the laughter. No? Okay, so at least I make myself laugh, right? So you have the different colored cats. And I have a bunch of cats. And then I want to categorize them based on their color. You have a white cat, you have an orange cat, you have a gray cat. So then you're categorizing them based on color. That would be a categorical variable. Even if people self-categorize, that's still a categorical variable. If they categorize themselves into categories, or even if you do it, let's say we did ethnicity, but we left it open-ended, and people responded, I'm Hispanic, I'm Latinx, I'm Salvadorian, I'm Guatemalan, I'm Peruvian American, Chicana, Chicanx, right? All these categories, but you decided, well, all these identities that stem from Mexico, Central America, and South America, I'm going to categorize into Latina, Latino, or Latinx. You could do that, right? Then you take the responses, categorize the participants based on this category you have. You would explain in your paper that you did this. And now I mean not in your paper. Well, some of you might, but I mean like before publishing, for publishing. And that would be a categorical variable, right? Because there's categories for ethnicity. And even if you had Peruvian, Salvadorian, or Peruvian American, Salvadorian American, Mexican American, Brazilian American, or Brazilian, all these different categories, that's still categorical, right? You might have 1,000 categories, but still categorical. So keep that in mind. Now, keep in mind, we have one categorical, we have one quantitative. So what do you do with this? Actually, I'm not going to go into this. I would actually recommend going, well, okay, you know what? Yeah, let me go over this. So there's different types of categorical variables. This is more so you could get an idea of what counts as a categorical variable. Now, there are nominal scales, which is these examples I gave you with ethnicity, cat color, right? There are dichotomous variables, dichotomous categorical variables, and this would simply mean, yes, you are this, or no, you're not that. Are you a student? Yes, 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 no, 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 no. Two options. Here in this image, you have a dichotomous variable. Dog, dog, not dog, right? So it's kind of, if you have some experience with computer programming, it's like 1 and zeros, right? You are part of the category or you're not part of the category. You also have ordinal. That one, actually, you could ignore that one because I think that one's a little bit more confusing, but just keep in mind those first two options, right? These are the kind of categorical variables I'm going to be reviewing. Now, what do you do when you have these type of variables and you're trying to describe them, graph them? So you've actually probably done a study, probably in 320, where you had one categorical variable and you had one quantitative variable. So let me give you some examples. So for example, on the left, you actually have a categorical variable along the x-axis. You have where did you meet your spouse, online or offline, right? Two different options. It's not how many times did you meet your wife before marrying, that would be quantitative, right? It's where did you meet, this option or this option, online or offline. Now here we have all the participants for online in pink. I'm looking at the left. And here we have all the participants for offline on the right. Keep in mind that all these dots represent a participant. This is what it looks like when you use a scatter plot and you have one categorical variable. It looks like two lines, right? They kind of line up underneath the categories, but we only care about the averages. So interpreting this, it's kind of difficult. Instead, the recommendation for when you have one categorical variable is to use a bar graph. So keep that in mind. That's key. That's very important. When you have a bivariate correlation and one variable is categorical, you should use a bar graph to do the graph and a t-test. When you have two variables and one's categorical. So when you look on the right, you see the two bar graphs, same data, right? Where did you meet your spouse, online or offline? Pink is online, blue is offline. And then you have marital satisfaction. I forgot to point that out, but on the y-axis, you have marital satisfaction, which is a quantitative variable. How happy are they in their marriage? On the left, it's kind of hard to see if there's a difference just in the averages, right? Because in these kind of statistics, we care about the averages. When you have the bar graph, though, you can see that the difference, right? You can see that there looks like there's a small difference. We would have to do an actual t-test in SPSS to figure out if this was significant, but still, it's easier to see that, at least eyeballing it, it looks like there might be a difference. So actually, this was a significant difference where people who met online tended to be happier than people who met offline, which is surprising to a lot of people. A lot of people think, at least when this study was done, maybe attitudes have shifted, but people thought, well, no, you need to meet people in person, you need to get to know them, and these are more meaningful relationships. But maybe no, maybe people who meet online can vet the person, can kind of look into their background, can cyber stalk him, see, is this a creeper? Is this person safe? Are they racist? Have they gotten in jail? Sometimes those records show up. And maybe they did more research before dating this person. So here you actually see that the people who met online tend to show more marital satisfaction. But I'm kind of thinking about the best way to connect this with what you've learned before. But the main thing to point out is that you've probably looked at these kind of studies before, where you have two groups being compared. Might be low income to middle class participants, might be based on ethnicity, education attainment, comparing white to Latino or Black participants, right, students. So you've seen this kind of research before, you've heard about it in this way before. So this isn't new, right? This is just a different way of presenting bivariate correlations. But the main thing to remember from this is if you have a bivariate correlation, if you have two variables that we're checking to see if there's a correlation between them, right, bivariate correlation, and one is categorical, you would use a bar graph to graph it, not a scatter plot. And you would use a t-test to see if there was a difference between the categories. Now, the t-test is checking to see if there's a difference between the categories in terms of the means. All right, so keep that in mind. And that's the last slide. Let me know if you have any questions.